Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics. In this episode, we're going to have a look at all of the oscilloscopes in my herd, or horde, whatever you prefer. I am going through all the stuff that has videos and link them in the description below, and also show you stuff that never got videoed, for reasons that I'll explain when I show those pieces of equipment. So sit back, relax, and have a look at all of this oscilloscope goodness. So let's get started. I had plans of putting this on a nice background, like on the lawn with flowers behind it and stuff like that, but three things are currently preventing me from doing that. It is snowing outside, it's 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's kind of dark. So the bench over here is going to have to do. So on with this. This was episode number 1, the first Artifact Electronics repair video. And the subject is a Sony Tektronix 305 portable oscilloscope. This one had an interesting problem in that the voltages were off, and essentially you couldn't, waveforms wouldn't extend very far up or down. And I measured things and found that they were bad. I was losing voltages on the way, but I finally solved this problem visually when I noticed that there was a PCB screw missing, and that screw happened to be a grounding point for that PCB. So putting in a new screw fixed the problem very, very quickly, and it's been working real nice ever since, including the digital multimeter over here, which wasn't affected by the scope problem that I fixed, but it's been working well since. Problem with it is that the batteries have long since given up their life, but I could replace them if I wanted to. They're a bunch of rechargeable D-size batteries, but I don't plan on taking this on the road, so that repair is going to have to wait until the necessity arises. It is, however, really useful when you're working on something that doesn't fit on your bench, such as the Asteroids Cocktail Arcade I repaired, and it was really useful because of its moderate size. It was easy to fit it into the mess I had created in order to measure voltages and waveforms and getting the asteroids to work again. This one is from episode 4. It's Tektronix TDS 460 4-channel oscilloscope. And the problem with this one was it had a whole bunch of leaky surface mount capacitors that had leaked but not really destroyed a lot of the traces. So those capacitors got replaced and cleaned up. The board got cleaned up, but it still didn't work. I think this one also had a bad voltage regulator. Oh, it did have a bad voltage regulator that had one of its traces actually eaten by the capacitor electrolyte. And once that was fixed, it sprang right back to life. It's a nice all-round oscilloscope. It's digital, but it has a really nice display, and they started to add extra functionality to these, such as frequency counter, peak-to-peak measurements, and stuff like that that show up on the screen. It's a very useful scope, and I'm really glad this one came back to life. Other than that, not much to say on it. Unfortunately, it has a fan in it, which drives me crazy, so I usually prefer scopes that don't have fans in them. But other than that, it's a nice scope. And of course, it still works. There was a follow-up video to this scope, and that is video number 15. And what happened was, after I originally repaired it, a few days later it started to act up again, and that was mostly with controls. It wasn't responding properly to controls. So I opened it up, I checked out the PCB in here, and it also had some leaky capacitors, which I replaced and changed. And the buttons still weren't responding, so I went in here, took the front panel off, and started cleaning off the membranes, at which point disaster struck. I was using alcohol on a Q-tip, but I started getting the conductive traces that these buttons completed a circuit on. The one over here just up and disappeared. I mean, I washed it clean off, and it was disaster, because the bottom contact membrane is essentially glued to the frame of the oscilloscope. There was no way to repair it. But at that point, I was so pissed off about it, I knew I was going to do anything I could to fix this thing. And the way I fixed it was I got a really cheap parts TDS 420, and the 420, well, I got the 420 and it had a dead screen, and I didn't care about it too much, but it had the exact same frame with the key membrane glued to it. So what I did at that point was essentially swapped everything into the frame of the 420, put it all back together again, and as you can see, it still works beautifully now. There was no other solution to do that, because if anybody was selling the contact strip for these buttons, yeah, I would have bought it, but in the end it probably would have cost me more than just buying the parts machine, which not only gave me the specific part I needed, but now I have a whole bunch of parts, not everything, but a whole bunch of parts that are compatible between the 460 and the 420. Now let me give credit to where credit's due. Here's the donor. This is a TDS 420, also 4-channel scope. This became the parts donor. When I first got it, it powered on. You could hear the fan running, but nothing appeared on the screen. And of course I couldn't help myself. I repaired the screen on it, and it was actually fully functional. I think it had a bad high voltage diode somewhere, and it came up. So it came up, I tested the buttons, and they all worked. Thus, even though it seemed like a shame to switch frames on it, the main mission was to fix the 460. So I did do a frame swap on it, and the 460 came back, of course. But this won't even turn on because the contact strip is, I mean, it's completely gone. None of the buttons work even on here. But it's got a working board set in it and a whole bunch of parts, including a CRT, that will always be there to help me keep the 460 and whatever else shows up running. Thanks, 420. Here we have episode number 12, which is a Fluke PM3370B hybrid oscilloscope. This is actually a Philips built scope that I guess Fluke just licensed, or I don't even think they licensed it. I think Philips built the whole thing and wrote Fluke on top of it and changed the case color. It is a nice scope though. This one was a rather large pain to fix. The screen didn't work, and then there was a bunch of D to A converters in there that went bad, because pretty much everything is soft controlled. All of the focus, brightness, and stuff like that, the actual signal doesn't run through those. They're just rotary encoders that change the values, which are then generated by the scope, run through a D2A, and do their job. Took a while, and there were some parts. Fortunately, I found all of the parts, and it was worth it. It's a nice scope. It is hybrid. It's in analog mode right now, I can switch it to digital. I mean, a lot of this measuring stuff and so on obviously doesn't work in analog mode on this. You have to be in digital mode to do these things. And you can see some sampling noise. I don't know if that shows up on the camera, but you can see some sampling noise in the waveform, whereas when you switch it to analog, you just get a beautiful waveform out of it. Glad this one came back. I still use it every so often. Now here's an oldie. This comes from episode 22. It's a Heathkit O-12 oscilloscope, and I think this was a kit. You know, I'd have to go watch the video to remember all the details about this, but it was relatively cleanly built, but I can't remember what was wrong with it either. The guy I bought it from basically wanted to take it to the scrap heap, and I got it for a few bucks, because that exceeded what the scrapyard was going to pay him for it. And I think it was definitely worth it. It's a really old scope, works really nice. It's not too bright anymore, but it's trying to make up for it with the power light. It's single channel. I think it's like 5 megs, but it's a piece of scope history. It's a piece of test instrument history, and I'm really glad it came back to life. It was not very complicated. It may have been a capacitor or two, and it's of course all tube based. And as you can see, it's still working. So here is a mostly useless for bench work oscilloscope, but I think somewhat historically significant. So this one's definitely going to stay in my collection. And this brings us to episode number 27. It's an EICO 425 oscilloscope. Kind of an interesting, pleasant color scheme on it. I don't remember this one working right, but it's basically doing a little dance now. And I think everybody can guess what that is. I think one of the caps just finally gave up. I mean, it looks like that. One of the filter caps in the power supply is completely opened up, or is super leaky. But we can still see a trace on it. It still kind of works. The focus is all the way to the right, but that may have something to do with the filter cap being open and it not supplying enough voltage to properly focus it. The intensity does go up and down, and it works. This one was really rusty, cleaned off. Most of it came off. It's about the same age as the Heath, I think. Also completely tube based. This one actually had a bad tube in it, and things kind of came back once I swapped out the bad tube for a good one. But I need to label this that this definitely needs a cap job, at least in the power supply section. But I think that'll bring it back to its former glory. And just like the Heath, not super useful in real life, but also a piece of history. And it actually works. I mean, putting a scope on your bench or on your shelf and saying, hey, this thing's 50 years old or 60 years old, but it doesn't work, what good is that? You need to be able to demonstrate that these things still have life in them. And so a scope that, an older scope that doesn't work, I will usually not keep it around. If I can't repair it, I won't keep it around. Well, I might keep it around for parts, but I won't put it on a shelf and display it and show off to people that I have this really old scope, because any equipment that doesn't work is really only good for parts and should be hidden away. In my not so humble opinion. Looks like I unintentionally skipped scope in the chronological video order. Here we have episode number 18, a Tektronix 465M analog scope. And this one, it's a really nice scope. I guess this one was made specifically for the US Navy. And I mean, it's kind of a little bit kooky looking with that plastic case, and it's not really rectangular, but it's a really nice scope. It's a pure analog Tektronix scope, and what else can I say about it? It still works just fine. I actually had a voltage problem in it. I think it had a shorted capacitor, or an open, no, it had an open capacitor, and it was causing all sorts of weird problems. I mean, it didn't have a single problem, but I was jumping through the modes, and it was doing something different everywhere. And finally I went through it, and I just kind of did some troubleshooting, and I found the bad capacitor, and all of the modes started to work in it. Now this also had a follow-up, and that was episode number 23, where I found an identical unit to this at the same place where I'd gotten this, which was the university surplus, and it had the exact same problem as this one. The same capacitor had gone bad, and of course as I replaced that one came back too. It was a nice scope, but I didn't need two of them, and that one has since left the herd. So this one's from episode 41. It's a Tektronix 574 scope. It's pretty old, all tube based, round CRT face, and I'm filming this one out here because it's so damn heavy. I'm not going to be able to get it on the bench, so we just have to be happy with the two baseline displays, but it works. It looks nice. I think the thing that was wrong with this thing was the fan didn't run, and once I unstuck the fan, it was kind of half seized. Once I unstuck it, the fan came on, and things seemed to be working. Now, it took about 5 minutes after this thing sitting here for a few months for the fan to come up. When I turned it on, it just kind of buzzed, but after 5 minutes, it just gradually increased it. So maybe it has microprocessor fan speed control in there, and maybe the fan just is going back to its old ways, and I guess it's like an old car. I gotta start this thing up periodically so the fan doesn't think about seizing again. One thing that attests to this scope's weight comes with two handles. How many scopes have two handles on them? And yeah, this one's a bitch. It is really heavy, but it's really cool. Should probably make a display out of this with the Heath and the EICO next to it, and make that a shrine to 50s technology. Kept saying that this thing was large and heavy. Heavy, you're gonna have to take my word for it, but here's a better indicator of scale with the Sony Tektronix next to it. So yeah, she's a big one. You wouldn't want to take this one into the field, and if you do, you need a forklift and either a fusion cell or a really long extension cord. Now we come to a big fail. This was in episode 54. It's an HP 54200A digital oscilloscope. And again, I don't remember exactly what I did to it. I think the screen may have been bad, but the problem was that channel 2, I couldn't get channel 2 to work at all. And channel 1 was acting weird. I mean, I'm using the auto scale function. That's the only way I can get it to display a trace. But there's like a 1 volt signal going into it, and see if I can show you what it's thinking it's doing. Now, of course, you can't see it. Come on. Anyway, it's telling me that the range is 9.1 volts and the offset is 13.36 volts. Still can't see it. I'd have to play with the contrast, but that's all hidden in the menu somewhere. So this is the best I can do. I tried to adjust the range and offset and the trace just disappeared. So I guess, you know, if you watch the episode, you'll see the trials and tribulations involved in it. Sure looks nice, but it has a really horrible user interface. So I wasn't really that motivated to go after it and fix it. And I think that one of the acquisition channels is bad in it, and they were all proprietary chips. So maybe another one will come along and I'll have a good screen and control panel for it. But other than that, not much more to say for this. And we'll just leave it at that. And on to the next one. This was in episode number 61, and it's a TDS 340 oscilloscope. And I remember this one didn't turn on at all. Nothing happened. I think it did some relay clicking, and then I opened it up and the power supply was clicking, and it was a power supply problem. And once that was fixed, it came right up. Just a nice scope like all of the TDS series. It works great, everything in it works, and not much I can say about this one. So we'll keep this particular one really short, but another TDS in my collection. And on to the next one. But let's gaze at that beautiful display first. And a little more. And we're done. And here's the last scope that we have a video on. It's video number 63. It's a Telequipment D54. And it's from Guernsey in the Channel Islands. This was a $5 scope that I almost passed by. But it kind of looks similar to Tektronix, even though the colors are off. And I think I walked by it, and then all of a sudden the brain said, wait a minute, that looked like a Tektronix. And I went back. This was in a thrift store, and there it was, covered up with all sorts of junk. There wasn't a whole lot wrong with this. I remember, I think the focus control didn't work on this, and so and you couldn't get a very good display out of it. But obviously that one was fixed, and it's an okay scope. I mean, compared to the new stuff, it's more on the useless side than anything else, but it has a nice analog trace, and anything with a nice analog trace is always welcome on or near my bench. So not much more to say about the scope or any of the other ones. Have a look at the video links in the description if you want to know the details about how these were repaired or not. So now we look at the remainder of my scopes, and these do not have videos made specifically for them for various reasons. The one you're looking at now is a Type 561A 4-channel scope. It has the 2B67 time base plug-in on the right and the 3A74 quad trace plug-in over here. And the reason there's no video for this is it's got a whole bunch of Nuvotron tubes in it, and they're all leaking pretty badly. So it's really difficult. I mean, things just wander all the time. Did I make that? Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, as you can see, the trace just, it's not stable, and if you let it sit for a while, I mean, you can adjust all the traces just perfect, and you come back 5 minutes later and they're all over the place, which I would say are the Novotron tubes that are doing that. So I wasn't really ready to spend the big bucks on, let's see, how many are in there, 8 or 12 of them, to spend like $200 or whatever to buy new tubes, where the scope itself was like $5. Maybe one day I'll find a cheap source and I'll go in and I'll fix this thing completely, but here it is, and there is, I don't know how much the camera masks it, but it's the trace wanders, and it's not bad caps that it wanders, because it's wandering at random intervals. The other channels do work. There's one. Oh, and this one. So there's your 4 traces. But I'm not going to deal with the traces. All the channels work, but it's kind of a pain in the ass, because once you get it adjusted, things just wander after a few minutes, and it's all over the place. And I tested those the Novotron tubes, and yes, they're all leaky. So still a nice scope, but I guess it's just going to have to sit here and wait till I get the motivation to finally fix it. And there you have it. It's got a really, I mean, it's a nice analog scope. It is all tube based. And see, it's beginning to go bananas already. Oh. But anyway, there you have it. I guess you could use it for a music score. But see, the problem is when I turn this off, it completely disappears. I'm not exactly sure why all the traces are disappearing when there is, I guess it needs at least one triggered input on it. And, oh, there you go. So it's a matter of changing the trigger level, and we can, but look at that, when that passes 0, everything disappears. And so there's still something strange going on in there. It's definitely salvageable, but not high on my list of priorities. Next we have a Hitachi model V212 20 meg dual channel scope. It's a low-end scope, but it's fully analog, and it's the curiosity about this one is I got it from a local seller who said that a few years ago, or I guess more than a few years ago, he wanted to learn electronics by correspondence, and this was the scope that he got for his experiments and lessons. But he kind of lost interest in the whole thing after a while, and this was just sitting in the box. It's mint, came in the box with probes, manuals, paperwork, everything. It was pretty cheap, and it's light, and it doesn't have a fan, and it's a really good analog scope for just signal display. Not accurate enough for making measurements or anything like that, but it's in really nice shape, and it comes on the bench every so often when I quickly need a scope that is very uncomplicated. This one was my main and only scope for several years, a Tektronix 2246 quad channel 100 meg device, and this came a few years. I mean, I had this years before I started the channel, and it's an analog scope. It basically did everything I needed it to do, especially with 4 channels. It hasn't needed any service, and unfortunately it has a fan, as you can hear. I hope you can hear. But it did pretty much everything I needed. It has some rudimentary on-screen display measurement capabilities that work okay, and it's basically my my go-to analog scope. That it's the first one I pull out when I need some analog stuff to be done, and I'm very familiar with it, so it's usually a no-brainer to pull this guy out, power him up, and let him do whatever he needs to do. It's a good scope. I can't tell you anything about general reliability. My experience is very good with it. I think I tore it open once just to look inside, but again, everything works on it, and it's a scope I would recommend because they've become somewhat cheap, and it's a real workhorse. And finally, the most modern scope by far that I own is this Tektronix TDS 1202B, 200 megahertz dual channel. And really this replaces a lot of test instruments because it has things like frequency counters built in. You can actually, instead of having a really small display of the frequency, make it so that the whole window is occupied by the frequency count, several modes of measuring. You can adjust the sample rates on it and get a pretty analog looking signal coming out of it. Really nice scope, and this is nice and very dependable. I haven't looked inside, but I would assume there's not a whole lot inside. There's an LCD screen and probably a do-it-all processor and some signal conditioning in there. It's a nice scope. It's still kind of weird when I carry it around. It's really, really light, and really not much else to say about it. It's you can read up on, modern scopes have obviously advanced in leaps and bounds because they're all software controlled, and people are beginning to write some good software for these. But it's not analog, and other than that, it's a great bench instrument that I would recommend if you want to spend the kind of money. I think it was about $1,200 or $1,300 new. But this has definitely already paid for itself, because you don't have to have an array of test instruments sitting on the bench if you're quickly checking out a bunch of stuff, and digital signals as well as analog signals. So there you go. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the walk down oscilloscope lane, and leave me a comment. Let me know if you have one of these, what do you think of them, and what other scopes you may have and are absolutely in love with, and is something that should definitely be added to my collection. Click all the right buttons, make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you for the next exciting episode. Bye.